I'm going to be talking about Ethereum consensus, proof of stake, staking incentives, and Gasper. As already introduced, I work for the Robust Incentives Group. We look at kind of everything incentives, strategic decision-making of consensus participants, which is a broad kind of lens in the land of crypto. You can find most of our work on rig.ethereum.org. Consensus. So basically, in Ethereum you can think of it as having sort of two layers. We have the execution layer, which is kind of like interprets and runs the data. So kind of everything, transactions, smart contracts, fee markets, and all those fun topics. And today's talk is going to be focused more on the consensus layer, where we're trying to kind of come to consensus on what should be the canonical chain. Now, consensus mechanisms is actually, what's the consensus mechanism and what are we trying to achieve here? We're trying to come to consensus under open and dynamic participation. So we want anyone to be able to join the consensus formation process, and we want it to be dynamic, meaning that these participants should be able to come and go as they please. And so this consensus mechanism has a few ingredients that we kind of need. On the one hand, we have the leader selection process, so proof of stake, proof of work are such mechanisms. And then we have a consensus algorithm by which we need to decide, given valid block proposals, what's actually the canonical chain that we want to make canonical. And then we need some incentives and cryptography on top, and all of this together gives us a consensus mechanism. Let's dive into some of these sections for a bit. Right. So the basic first fundamental question we need to answer is who has the right to propose a block, right? We kind of need a rate limiting mechanism or a cyber resistant mechanism. In proof of work, we do this with basically computation. So we have this cryptographic puzzle, as we all know, I guess here. And in proof of stake, we have these leaders that are selected from a bonded set of participants. Now that we have basically a leader, the question then is, how do we make progress? And given these block proposals, what should end up as being part of the canonical chain? And this is where kind of the consensus algorithm or fork choice rule comes into play. In Bitcoin, we have this relatively very elegant and simple rule that basically says, follow the longest chain. The intuition here is basically, in proof of work, one CPU is basically one vote. So you can't really spin up kind of infinite amounts of identities without expending the cost of actually running CPU units. And so what do we actually vote on? Well, we kind of want to kind of continue the chain. And to do so, we need to spend that energy. And what happens now if you end up voting wrong? So basically extending the chain that does not become part of the canonical chain, well, you end up just wasting your energy effectively. If we do it in proof of stake, where we have these coins and we're kind of proportional to your amount of stake in the system, you're elected to propose a block. If you do that naively, you could end up in a world where basically there's nothing at stake and you just end up voting on all possible kind of branches. Because unlike in proof of work, where you actually have to spend energy to be able to propose a block, you could vote on different branches at no cost. The nice thing here is obviously that we have this set of bonded validators, meaning given that they're bonded, we can also take away their stake. So the kind of very high-level basic flow here on Ethereum is that if you want to become a consensus participant, you lock up some ETH, 32 on Ethereum. Once that kind of is, the deposit is activated on the beacon chain, so the consensus layer, and the user is sort of now an active participant in the Gasper consensus, which we'll dive into in a moment. Now, once you're part of this kind of active set of validators, you're assigned some duties by the consensus protocol. Every now and then you're supposed to propose a block. You'll get a reward for it if you do so correctly. And every now and then you're supposed to vote on what you think is the valid block. Now, one side of the kind of incentive structure here is these rewards, as just mentioned. The other side is that if you misbehave, you can also be penalized. So, for example, if you do a bad job by just being offline, and so when you were supposed to vote, you actually were offline, and so you just didn't vote, you will be sort of penalized by losing some amount of that bonded position. And if you behave kind of very badly by doing something malicious, for example, signing conflicting messages, we'll get into that in a moment, you can be slashed, which is kind of a more extreme form of penalties. And so the high-level point here is that in proof-of-work land, we kind of have only this reward kind of dimension, whereas in proof-of-stake, we have both rewards but also penalties, which gives us a sort of new dimension in order to kind of incent correct behavior in the system. And so one thing here is, again, also that in proof of work, you kind of have this notion of probabilistic finality. Finality basically, for now, just means once a block is confirmed, it doesn't change its position anymore. And in proof of stake, we can make more precise statements about this, which we'll dive into the details in a moment. But essentially, coming back to this slashing idea, the fact that these participants are bonded means that if they sign messages such as the block proposal, and for example, you propose here in the case, does this work? No. But here on the left side, we have a case where, for example, a block proposer proposes two blocks, C and C prime, that are conflicting with one another. And so if now a proposer signs these two blocks, you can prove that to the protocol, and the protocol can then proceed to slash this consensus participant. And then we have some other cases here where we have on the right, we have a surround vote, and in the middle a double vote. These are basically just types of conflicting messages that should not be allowed, because effectively what we're trying to do is we're trying to come to consensus on a canonical chain, and these types of messages are clearly conflicting and not helping, and so we're trying to disincentivize it by slashing. And so the nice thing with these kind of slashing, the nice thing that we can do is basically that we can guarantee, we can make economic guarantees about finality. So essentially, unless at least 1/3 of all staked ETH is so basically two conflicting blocks cannot be finalized unless at least 1/3 of all ETH is slashed, which is, I think, staked ETH at the moment is on the order of more than $100 billion US. So it's quite a hefty price to pay. With the caveat also that this attack you can only execute once. And so, yeah, I mean, here point just being again, it's very expensive and you can only do it once. We'll get into some of the details. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through some of these slides. Let's go into maybe some of the more kind of low-level specifics of how this actually works. Before that, I want to kind of introduce briefly two kind of properties that consensus protocols are typically kind of analyzed through. One being liveness and the other one being safety. Liveness just referring to the fact that if there's a valid transaction, it kind of should be included in the chain in a somewhat timely fashion. And safety meaning that once a transaction is confirmed, its position within the chain shouldn't change. So you don't want to have blocks moving around once you've kind of considered them confirmed. That seems intuitive enough, I guess. And now, once you have a protocol is considered secure if it fulfills these two properties of liveness and safety. Right, let's kind of get into it. A very kind of classic type of consensus algorithm is this PBFT protocol, which stands for Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance. And it's the basis of the vast majority of kind of proof-of-stake protocols in different kind of flavors, but the underlying idea is essentially this algorithm here. Say a leader proposes a block, X. Now we're trying to kind of come to consensus on that everyone thinks that this is valid and everyone knows actually. So basically you want to get to a stage where everyone knows that everyone sees this block and everyone wants this to be canonical, and that you need to know that the other people also know. And so the idea here being that this block is proposed, and then there is a bunch of the consensus participants now basically vote on this block. If the block's valid, proposed on time, and all these types of things, you will probably want to vote for it as canonical. And so you will send a message that basically says, I think this block should be consensus. And now if you see enough of these kind of what we call, or like what's called prepare messages, so if you see 2/3 of all consensus participants sending these prepare messages, you're going to send a pre-commit message saying effectively, I've seen that 2/3 of all consensus participants want this block to be consensus. Now you might think you can stop here. But the problem is that you don't know that everyone else has also seen these 2/3 wanting to be consensus. And so you need one more round, because otherwise you might get locked into a kind of, if you commit as the only one and everyone else is not actually kind of trying to finalize this block in the end, you're stuck because you can't jump the chain, because like what I said earlier, you can get slashed for basically signing these conflicting messages. And you're going to be stuck on some kind of block tree, whereas everyone else is trying to make progress on that. And so you have to really make sure that everyone knows that everyone else also knows. And so basically, once you've seen 2/3 of people wanting to make something consensus, you then send a message saying, I've seen 2/3 agree that 2/3 agree. And so basically, that concludes then this kind of round of consensus. A very natural question here to ask is like, where's this 2/3 coming from? And so for that, let's kind of look at two scenarios here. The short version is you could also agree that economic finality, you could consider something final if 80%, it's a trade-off. And so let's look at the trade-off space here. The more kind of intuitive, simple one here is basically the liveness guarantee that we're trying to maintain. So if an adversary is smaller than 1/3, then they can't delay finalization. Or let's assume the adversary is 1/2. Well then, given our 2/3 majority, supermajority votes that we need to come to consensus, then you can't get there, obviously, if half of it is controlled by an adversary, because they simply could go offline and kind of stall the progress of this finality. The other case here, a safety fault, is let's look at the kind of minimum condition that would allow an adversary to get to a point where two conflicting blocks are finalized. So here's the scenario. You have block A and you have block B. And the adversary that has 1/3 of all stake votes for both blocks. So right now, block A and B both have 1/3 of all stake voting for it. Now, somehow, this adversary now needs to convince half of honest consensus participants to vote for block A and the other half for block B. In that case, because the adversary is 1/3, the 2/3 split in half, and so you have 1/3 voting for A and 1/3 voting for B, which basically just means that both block A and B meet this 2/3 threshold, and both blocks would be considered final.
Just a quick question. This may be completely obvious, but how do you identify that these participants are actually distinct? Like, aren't they anonymous?
I mean, they're pseudonymous. So I don't know who in this room, if there's any stakers around, is which kind of validator index. But when you deposit stake, you're kind of assigned this validator index. And so the protocol just sees these validator indices.
But in principle, it's possible that the same person creates different.
Absolutely.
Different validators.
Yes. In fact, like, yeah. You can control many validators. It's not based on the, yeah.
So a block is proposed and then gets added to the chain, right? In 6 minutes before consensus is achieved, is that right?
So we'll actually get to this in a moment. You're right that finality happens only so often. It takes, for a block to get finalized, it takes 12.8 minutes, 6.4 to get justified, but there's kind of, the chain still makes progress in the meantime, and it's a great setup for the next section. Because basically, Ethereum's consensus is called Gasper. It's the combination of LMD Ghost and Caspar FFG. LMD Ghost is an available chain which basically makes continuous progress every 12 seconds. There is a block proposal. And then the finality gadget, which is the order of like the time frame you're referring to, basically only tries to kind of finalize these checkpoints. And so LMD Ghost stands for, hear me out, latest message-driven, greediest, heaviest observable subtree. It sounds a whole lot more complicated than it is. And Caspar FFG is the friendly finality gadget. It's a friendly ghost.
Mathematically, it's removing the Markov property of the chain.
What do you mean, take a piece out of it?
So again, the block is proposed, 6 minutes go by, it's not finalized. Maybe it's because there's one transaction wrong. How do you redo the whole chain given that you've now taken out one piece?
So the available, so the way it works, the way it works is that the available chain, it doesn't have the same, the tip of the chain doesn't have the same guarantees as a block that is eventually finalized. And so you're basically going to have to wait until you get to that economic finality if you rely on that sort of guarantee. But there is already, maybe let's just kind of...
That's basically the same way Bitcoin works, right? You wait 8 blocks or whatever before you consider it final on Bitcoin. So it's effectively the same.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like it might take you 12.8 minutes for a block to actually get finalized, but in the meantime, there's still a lot of stuff already going on. People are voting on that block, and it gets more, like at some point you can almost consider it economically final, even though it's technically not yet because of all the votes that this block is already accumulating. And then you can have, like, if you make some synchrony assumptions, you already kind of get to similar levels of economic guarantee. But here maybe this diagram kind of, they don't need to fully understand it now, hopefully we'll get there in a moment, but shows you this kind of idea of having an available chain. Here we see like block 0, 1 all the way to 95, where every slot there's a new block. And then these blocks 0, 32, and 64 is what we call epoch boundary blocks. So the first block in each epoch. And those are the ones that we're trying to finalize. And so we have this available chain that goes on continuously, and then we have this finalization gadget that kind of lives on top and like every 32 slots tries to finalize.
But perhaps you left out something that might actually help. And is
Yep.
what I'm about to say correct? in each epoch, there's a subset of validators that are voting, a smaller set than the bigger, larger set. And
so
you're collecting additional votes after the epochs. That's why you are adding more and more weight to the decision, right?
so you have every single validator voting exactly once per epoch. So within one epoch is 32 slots. And so each slot you basically have whatever the validator set divided by 32 voting, so like roughly 30,000 validators each slot voting. But over the course of one epoch, you've had the entire validator set vote. And so basically you make sure that the entirety of the validator set is part of the finalization process.
There's no sortition. There is no sortition.
No, like, yeah, I mean, you basically have the slot based, but then over the course of an epoch, everyone's voting.
But is everybody voting on every block, or is everybody only voting on the block that's assigned to their validator set?
So every validator is assigned a specific slot to be voting on what they consider the head of the chain, which is kind of a vote that is concerned with the available chain, which will maybe we'll use that as a transition. Well, actually no, but and then when they're supposed to vote. So let's say you're validator I, you're assigned to vote in slot 1. You're going to vote on what you think is head of the chain in slot 1, probably block 1 if it was on time and looks good to you. And at the same time, you're going to make votes that are part of this finality gadget, which I think it makes sense to do in a moment when we get there. But so you do kind of both things at the same time. You're kind of contributing to trying to finalize a block on that finality gadget level, but at the same time you're also contributing to what do I think is head of the chain on the available chain that happens on a slot basis. So LMD Ghost. So I mean we've covered most of this at this point already in some form or another, but basically time in Ethereum is divided into slots. Each slot is 12 seconds, and in each slot there's a couple of things going on. I think this is a PDF, so I'm not going to be, there's boxes that would be showing up, but essentially in each slot there is a block proposer selected by the protocol that is supposed to propose a block at the beginning of the slot. This is taken from the kind of protocol specifications. And then the attestation deadline is basically, there's a committee of attesters, which is basically 1/32 of the entire validator set that is voting every slot. And so they're supposed to vote on this block, whether they think it's head of the chain or not. Plus, they have this FFG duties that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then the third step here in the slot is basically you have this aggregation period because we're trying to like stuff 32,000 votes every 12 seconds into a block. So we have some sort of, it's just more of a kind of, to make it practically feasible kind of step. But in the yeah.
So when you have the voting, the validator is proposing a block and then 1/3 of the validators are voting.
1/32.
Sorry, 1/32. These 1/32 can include also the validator is proposing a block. Or it's
I mean, yes. I mean, you could control, say, 1,000 validators. Then you could have one of the validators happens to be proposing a block. And I think actually, yeah, but that's why we have these assumptions of 1/3, 2/3, where you kind of make assumptions on at least a maximum of 1/3 adversarial kind of participation, and then you still inherit all these properties.
So then effectively the rest of the validators are checking that block to see whether or not it should be slashed.
Yeah, I mean in general you can think of this committee of validators that votes every slot. So basically a block proposer has a sort of monopoly power. So for the duration of 12 seconds there's exactly one validator that can even propose a valid block. No one else can propose a block. The only alternative is no block whatsoever. And so then the committee is, if you can think of it as keeping this kind of proposer in check. there's a lot of different dimensions to it. Barnaby and Fahad and I wrote a paper on sort of timing games. So, for example, the proposer could try and like abuse their monopoly power by delaying the block proposal for as long as possible in order to accumulate more transaction fees and MEV, etc. And this committee kind of keeps the proposer in check because it kind of limits the proposer and what they can do. And it's kind of like, yeah, like a committee keeping in check the temporary monopolist. I mean, it's a monopoly, but it's a very short-lived one.
2 more minutes. And,
oh yeah, 2 more minutes. Right.
Your monopoly ends in 2 minutes.
So LMD Ghost, long story short, it's basically very simple. You walk down a block tree. Whenever there's a conflict, you don't know whether you should walk left or right because they're conflicting. You're going to walk down the path where most people have voted on. And then the LMD part just means you're going to look at only the latest messages of all the validators. But essentially, just walk down the block tree where most people have voted on, and you'll end up with the kind of tip of the chain eventually. Given the 2 minutes, I'm going to race a bit. Finalization. So remember what we talked about here with this PBFT protocol, where we're trying to kind of we have these 2 rounds. And in Ethereum, we call this justification and finalization. Where first, every block that wants to be finalized first needs to be justified. The justification period is basically 2/3, a block is considered justified if 2/3 say, I've seen this block and I want this to be canonical. This is here in block epoch n+2, block 64. Basically, throughout that epoch, all the validators are going to vote for the head of the chain, as well as give a target vote. And the target vote in the happy cases, they're going to vote for block 64. It's basically them saying, I want block 64 to be justified. Now, how do you finalize? Finalized is you need to be justified, just like we justified 64. 32 was justified at some point. And then it also needs to receive 2/3 of more than at least 2/3 source votes. Now, source votes are basically similar to target votes, except that in epoch n+2, you're going to say, my target vote is 64, and given that 64 is a child of 32, and 32 is justified, I'm basically going to, I basically put my source vote on block 32, with the caveat it needs to be a parent of 64. But long story short, you basically have these 2 rounds that take place where you first agree that something should be canonical, and then you're like, okay, now everyone has seen that, I've seen that everyone has seen that this should be canonical, so I'm willing to finalize it and commit to it. And at that point, I know that in order to produce a conflicting block, at least 1/3 of all stake would need to be slashed. Now, dynamic availability. So, I mean, this thing is pretty complex if you compare it to this thing. And so that's a huge trade-off that Ethereum is making in terms of complexity. But the reason, or one of the main reasons why Ethereum kind of went at length trying to come up with this thing, in fact, there's papers on like the cap theorem, which kind of says that dynamic availability and finality is not possible. Dynamic availability kind of is this idea of you want to kind of maintain liveness as participants enter and leave. So the available chain makes progress no matter how many people are online. I mean, if no one's online, you're not going to make progress. But say 50% drop offline, every second block still has a block, every second slot will still on average have a block proposer. And so you're going to still make progress on the available chain, even though half of the validator set is offline, which means you can't finalize because you can't reach the 2/3 quorum. And so you have the available chain that keeps chugging along, and once validators come back online again, they can start finalizing the available part. And there's even one step further where Ethereum kind of tries to finalize even in the absence of, let's say, 50% again. And how that works is there's this concept of an inactivity leak where if the chain doesn't finalize for a long enough period, then the inactivity leak kicks in, which basically eventually just kicks, like it kind of, offline participants will lose stake at an increased rate, so that they will eventually kind of be exited out of the protocol, which means that the online portion of the validator set will increase in share of total ETH staked, meaning at some point the online portion controls more than 2/3 of all stake again, which means you can finalize again. But yeah, there's a kind of long list. It's a long list of trade-offs essentially. I guess the summary here is like liveness safety, accountable safety implying finality, plus some dynamic availability. That's Ethereum in a nutshell. Thank you.